Okay, for this beat, it's going to be a bass drum on the 1, the and of 1, a snare on the 2 and the 4, and a bass drum on the 3 and the and of 3. So this is a symmetrical beat. You could almost play it as like a 2-4, a two-step, and I'll demonstrate it for you right now. Okay, for this beat, it's going to be a bass drum on the 1, a bass drum on the 3 and the and of 3, a snare on the 2, the and of 2, and a bass drum on the 4. So again, that's bass drum on the 1, bass drum on the 3 and the and of 3, snare on the 2 and the and of 2, and snare on the 4. I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Okay, for this beat, you're going to have a bass drum on the 1 and the and of 3 only, a snare on the 2 and the and of 2, and a snare on the 4. For the fill, you're going to have a crash on the 1, which is an 8th note, followed by 2/16ths on the snare, 4/16th notes on the high tom, 2 8th notes on the mid tom, 2 8th notes on the floor tom. So it's da, 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 okay, I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Okay, for this beat, you have a groove that I taught fairly recently, a bass drum on the 1, the and of 2 and the 3, and you're going to have a snare on the 2 and the 4. You're going to have, for the fill, an 8th note and 2/16ths on the snare, so it's da, 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 2 8th notes on the high tom, 4/16ths on the mid tom, and then 2 8th notes on the floor tom. And like I've done before, I'll play the groove and then the fill, the groove and the fill, and then eventually I'll play the groove 3 times, and then the 4th time on a fill. So I'll demonstrate that for you right now. again, we're going to have another solo, an easy drum solo written from the book. Basically, this one goes 2 measures of a groove that repeats, 1 measure of a fill, then you have 3 measures of a groove that repeats, then a fill, then you have 1 measure of a groove, 1 measure of a fill, 1 measure of a groove, 1 measure of a fill, and then you end on a sort of weird groove that I went over, I think, my 3rd day of Beat of the Day. Okay, so I'll go over that with you right now. Okay, I'm now going to play my second solo, and this is, again, still very basic, but pretty similar to the first one I played. It is a little more complicated, I guess. Again, they tend to, with the solos in this book, they tend to have 2 measures that are the same. Then they permutate or change up the drum beat a little bit for 1 measure, and then they put in a fill, and then they do it again. But honestly, it's like 3 measures of a groove, then a fill, then 2 measures of a groove, then a fill, then 1 measure of a groove, then a fill, then 2 measures, so back to 2 measures of a groove, and then end on a fill. So it seems to be the pattern with this book in terms of drum solos. The reason why these are difficult is because the groove, when you're playing with a band, usually, you'll play a groove the same exact way about 4 times or even 8 times. Or even 16 times. There's a lot more repetition, and with this solo, you're only going to be playing the same thing twice, 2 measures. You're not really playing a drum line here, you're playing something that's constantly changing and evolving over time. Alright, so I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Okay, for this beat, it starts out with a symmetrical groove. It's going to be similar to what I taught about a week ago, where you have a bass drum on the 1, the and of 1, on the 3 and the and of 3, and a snare on the 2 and the 4. Okay, your fill is going to start out with a crash on the 1, a high tom for the 2 and the and of 2. You're going to do a right crash for the 3, and then a mid tom for the 4 and the and of 4, and then you come back in on this crash for the 1 of the groove when you go back into the groove. So I'll demonstrate that for you right now. What I'll do is I'll play the groove once, and then the fill, groove, fill, and then eventually, after I've looped it enough, I'll play the groove 3 times, and then end with the fill on the 4th count. Okay? Let me demonstrate that for you right now. Okay, so for this beat of the day, it's going to be reverse of yesterday. Today, the bass drum is on the 1, the 3, and the end of 3. And you're going to put a snare on the 2 and the 4. You're going to put 2 snares on snare on the 1 and the end of 1 for the fill, and then a crash for the 2. For the 3 and the end of 3 is the high tom, and then a crash for the 4. And actually, I would suggest left crash for the 2, right crash for the 4, go back to the left crash for the not the end of the 1, the 1 when you go back into the groove. So I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Hi, this is another beat of the day. Okay, for this groove fill combination, we're going to start out with a groove that I taught earlier with the bass drum on the 1, the and of 1, and on the 3, a snare on the 2 and the 4. And then for the fill, you're going to go 2 8th notes on the snare, 2 8th notes on the high tom, and then a quarter note on the crash, left crash, and then a quarter note on the right crash. And then you crash back into the groove on the 1. Okay? So what I do to help me count this out is when I hit the crashes, I go 3, and then I count in my head the and, which we just hold out the note, and then 4 and. So I actually count those last 2 beats. So I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Alright, for this beat, we have a bass drum on the 1, bass drum on the end of 2, the end of 3, a snare on the 2 and the 4, which is the exact same beat as I taught earlier. For the fill, it's going to be 2 16ths on the snare, 2 16ths on the hi-hat, an 8th note crash with another 8th note crash, 2 8th notes on the mid-tom, 4 16ths on the floor tom. So it's going to go 1, E, and 2 E, and 3 E, and 4 E, and I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Okay, for this beat, it's going to be a bass drum on the 1, the and of 1, snare on the 2, the and of 2, bass drum on the 3, snare on the 4. So it'll be 2 and 4 and. Okay? So basically, you know, it's a pretty simple beat, very similar to the ones we've been going over, but then I'm going to throw in a fill. And I did 16th note fills in previous days, and I felt like I went into those too soon. Because we're doing 8th note grooves, it's probably good to start with 8th note fills. So you do that groove, and then it's going to be 2 snares, 2 hi-hats, tie-toms, 2 mid-toms, a crash, and then a snare. So 1 and, 2 and, 3 and, 4 We hit the bass drum with the crash. Okay? First I'm going to do it, the groove and then the fill, the groove and then the fill. And then I'm going to play the groove 3 times and then end on the fill on the 4th time, so you can get a feel for both ways. Normally in a song you're going to play a groove at least 3 times before you throw in a fill. Alright, I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Alright, so this is a groove that uses accented 16th notes. I believe that you'd hear this in hip-hop a lot. It's very similar to a groove that we played where you have a bass drum on the 1, the 3, and the and of 3. But instead you're going to displace that bass drum that's on the 3, and you're going to put it on the that means the A of beat 2. So just before beat 3, you play a bass drum. And it's also similar to a bass drum where you have where you have a bass drum on the 1, the and of 2, and the and of 3, except you're putting that bass drum in between the and of 2 and the 3. Okay, and you're putting it in between the hi-hat strokes. So you need to have a little bit of limb independence in order to play it. It is more difficult than the other grooves I've gone over thus far. But I'll demonstrate it for you right now. Okay, I think I should point out that in this groove, the bass drum is on the 1, the of 2, the and of 3. The snare is on the 2 and the 4. So again, bass drum on the 1, the of 2, the and of 3, snare on the 2 and the 4. I think that I mentioned the bass drum on the of 2, but I didn't mention the other notes. I'm going to try to play it again and slow it down so you can hear that that bass drum is going in between the hi-hat strokes. Okay, for this beat, it's almost identical to the beat played yesterday. Bass drum is on the 1 and the and of 3, snare is on the 2 and the 4. Instead of having a bass drum on the of 2, you have a snare on the of 2. And I already went over this beat for September 2015, last month. This beat actually shows up in a very popular classic rock song. I'm not sure the name. I can look it up and post about it. But anyways, it's because I've gone over it before, I'm going to play it at two different tempos. So you can hear the difference in tempo. If you play this a little bit fast, it's got a very good groove to it. But you want to try it slow at first, so you make sure you're putting that snare in between your hi-hat strokes, in between the and of 2 and the 3. Okay? So I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Okay, this next groove is still accented 16th note. I guess you could call it a syncopated groove, just like the last two I've gone over. For this groove, you have a bass drum on the 1 in the ah of 1. You also have a bass drum on the 3 in the and of 3. You have a snare on the 2 and a snare on the 4. So basically you're going to play your normal bass drum on the 1, but then you're going to put a bass drum just before the snare on 2. So it's ba, 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 ba. And then it goes into a normal groove for beat 3, where you have a bass drum on the 3, the and of 3, and a snare on the 4. So this is like a half syncopated groove, half normal groove. So I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Okay, so we have another syncopated 16th note or accented 16th note groove. We have a bass on the 1, but then you're going to put a snare on the ah of 1. There's no snare on the 2. There's a bass drum on the and of 2, the and of 3, and a snare on the 4. So this is a very strange groove, and I'll demonstrate it for you right now. So again, bass drum on the 1, and of 2, and of 3, snare on the ah of 1 and the 4. Okay, for this beat of the day, you have a bass drum on the 1, a snare on the 2 and the and of 2, a bass drum on the and of 3, a snare on the 4. That's for the groove. For the fill, we have crash, 8th note, followed by 2 16th notes on the snare, that's for the 1. And then you repeat it, the right crash, followed by 2 16ths on the snare. Then you have 2 8th notes on the high tom, or I'm sorry, 2 16th notes on the high tom, followed by an 8th note crash, and then 2 16ths on the mid tom, followed by an 8th note crash. I'll demonstrate that for you right now. Okay, for this day, or this beat, I'm going to try easy drum solo. It's page 17 of the book that I've been learning from, Drumming the Easy Way, by Tom Hapke. I can try to, scan the music and put it up for you. I really don't have time to explain every measure, but basically, in this solo, you play a groove twice. You kind of change it up a little. You play a permutation of that groove, and then you go into a fill. And so the first two measures are just bass on the 1 and the 3, snare on the 2 and the 4, the easiest beat. The first one I went over. And then the third measure is just you add a bass drum on the end of 3, and then you have a 1 bar, 1 measure fill. And then you go into a different beat that permutates per measure, actually, and then you go into a 2 measure fill, and this 2 measure fill is actually, it was very difficult for me to learn and memorize, because, I don't know, it's just an unusual thing, and it's kind of hard to keep your timing for a 2 measure fill, especially if you're not having a click track guide you. Then you go into 2 more measures of groove, but then you end on a fill. Okay, so again, I can't explain every note to you like I normally explain beat of the days, because this is a little more material, but you can either buy the book, Drumming the Easy Way, or request the sheet music, and I can scan it and put it up. I hope that's not plagiarism. But, I'm sure they wouldn't mind if somebody demonstrates the solo and shows an interpretation of it. Alright, here it goes.